Thank you. But what else?
Let's talk
What
about
else?
Japanese beauty standard while I get my hair colored. If you come to Japan,
Let me tell you something. Looks matters, okay? They
They
always have and they always will. Don't let nobody convince you otherwise. Humans are very shallow. It's part of our nature, okay?
What is a more ideal starting point for our conversation about beauty other than the embodiment of grace and desire herself? The Greek goddess whose ethereal beauty has transcended time through writings, sculptures, and paintings. The goddess of beauty herself, Aphrodite. When you think of Aphrodite, what form does she have in your mind? Does she have long, wavy blonde hair, pale skin with shining, mesmerizing ocean eyes? Aphrodite, also known as Venus in Roman, is a Greek goddess often associated with love, lust, pleasure, passion, and beauty. As a goddess of beauty, she is considered as the most desirable female form possible. So the curious thing, however, is that she doesn't even hold one single form. Whenever she was depicted in written work, they would seldom focus on her appearance. They would mostly focus on her narrative or her history as a Greek goddess. Even when she was physically depicted, for example in paintings or sculptures, she didn't even have one single appearance. One of her most well-known paintings is The Birth of Venus. It depicts the goddess arriving at the shore after her birth, emerging from the sea fully grown. Compare this birth of Venus with this birth of Venus. In other paintings, she might be depicted with blonde hair or with brown hair. Sometimes she's skinnier, other times she's chubbier. I've seen some sources say that this is because she is a goddess, so she's a shapeshifter, but because she is the female embodiment of beauty, it makes more sense that the way people depicted her has more to do with the time when that piece of work was created. Each sculpture, painting, or literary work reflects the ideals of that time period. Artists would depict Aphrodite a specific way because that was considered the epitome of beauty at that time. Medieval artists gave her high forehead, and modern painters showed her with flowing blonde hair because those were the ideals of their time. Much like Aphrodite, contemporary beauty standards are also ever-changing, shifting with the nuances of times, trends, and cultures. What was once considered beautiful now no longer is. What is considered beautiful in one country is considered a deformity in another. If you look closely to each beauty standards from different cultures, you can see how often they end up clashing. Take for example Asian beauty standards. They tend to prioritize pale skin, petite facial features, and a youthful appearance. For example, Bae Suzy from Korea or Angelababy from China, they're considered as one of the most beautiful girls of those countries. Now compare that to Western beauty standards. They typically tend to prioritize more tan skin, defined cheekbones, and a more curvaceous figure. Say for example Kim Kardashian or Angelina Jolie. Another example is how chubbiness was often perceived as a symbol of wealth, abundance, and good health back in the old days. Quote, plumpness was by no means considered a bad thing in medieval women. Vigarello, in his Metamorphosis of Fat, sees largeness as a sine qua non of female beauty in early medieval romances. The late 14th century Goodman of Paris says that a horse ought to have four qualities also found in comely maidens: handsome mane, beautiful chest, fine lawns, and large buttocks. This passage is showing us that back in the medieval times, there was a very different type of standards for women. Being skinny or thin was not the ideal because it was seen as a sign of poverty or unhealthiness. You might wonder, what does Aphrodite, a mythology figure, has anything to do with what's happening in modern times? After all, she is a myth, right? But who's to say that beauty standards aren't just another myth? According to Cambridge Dictionary, myth has two definitions: a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of people, or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. and a widely held but false belief or idea. I'm not trying to argue that beauty standards are not real or do not exist, which I will talk in depth later, but rather I'm trying to draw the similarities between the myths that the beauty standards give us and the myths of Aphrodite. So the definition I'll focus on is a bit of the mix of the two. Myths are stories or beliefs that are passed down through generations, becoming part of a culture's collective knowledge and understanding of the world. Or in other words, a myth is not a scientific fact or an objective truth. It is a subjective belief that is very meaningful and very powerful to set cultures and societies. What makes Aphrodite a myth is not simply because she's a supernatural entity, but because she is a story, part or was part of an universal truth. She was seen as a goddess of beauty, sexuality, and lust across many cultures. What gave her the power was the belief in her existence. If nobody sculpted her, if nobody painted her, if nobody worshipped her, would she even be remembered nowadays? Would she have had the impact that she had? Her legacy transcends the bounds of mere worship. It is her existence as a mythological figure and the embodiment of beauty, love, and desire that inspired the works of countless artists, poets, and philosophers throughout history. From the beauty of the birth of Venus to the evocative allure of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. Just like the myth of Aphrodite, beauty standards are sustained by the stories, ideas, or practices that people have around them. Without the paintings or sculptures and poems that feed into these ideals, they wouldn't have the same power or influence in our culture. But when and where does this begin? Well, the origin of Aphrodite can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology. According to Hesiod theology, the foam from which Aphrodite was born created this beautiful white-armed goddess. She then rose from the sea fully grown and dressed in a silicon robe. The origins of beauty standards is far much more complex. While some psychologists and scientists argue for a biological basis, others delve into the depths of history, tracing the emergence of beauty ideals to cultural practices, societal norms, and religious beliefs. Compels us to endure suffering in the name of beauty. Why do we restrict our diets even when surrounded by scarcity? Why do we risk life and limb for an elusive standard? Naomi Wolf raises and answers these questions in her book, The Beauty Myth. This book was published in 1991, pretty recently, and has not failed to gain popularity. Before I begin, it is important to note that although I am using the term the beauty myth, it is within our context, which I already clarified earlier. This video is not made based off the book. I share my own research and ideas while Naomi shares her own in her book. In Naomi's book, the term the beauty myth is a story that, quote, beauty is objective and universally exists. Woman's beauty must correlate to their fertility, and since this is a system based on sexual selection, it is inevitable and changeless. Naomi Wolf states that this is a myth because this is false. This is an important distinction because I do aim to dive into other perspectives. Naomi argues that although beauty claims to be about intimacy, sex, life, and celebration of women, it actually has nothing to do with women at all. Rather, it has everything to do with men's institutions and institutional power. The book is filled with examples of this, but I will only focus on a few. The first being the purity culture. Youth and virginity have always been seen as a staple of what makes a woman, what makes a woman beautiful. It was seen as a beauty standard. Naomi argues that this is because it stands for sexual ignorance. Aging in women is quote-unquote unbeautiful because women grow more powerful over time. The older generation feels shame for aging and envies the younger. The younger judges the older for aging, which further drives both generations of women away from one another. And the last one is quote-unquote the ugly feminist. When the feminist movement initially began, there was a caricature of the ugly feminists being spread around to ridicule the feminists in the 19th century. They would describe Victorian feminists as big masculine women wearing boots, smoking a cigar and swearing like a trooper, even if it was far from the truth. They stated that the feminists must be fat, ugly, incapable of satisfying a man, or, God forbid, lesbians. That very image drove people away from actually educating themselves on the real message that feminists were trying to spread. Although nowadays we can argue that being seen as a masculine woman isn't a bad thing, back then it was very, very different. What defined a woman's life was whether or not she could get into a good marriage, and that was defined by her appearance, which was defined by her femininity. Being seen as masculine was not ideal if you needed to survive. In Survival of the Prettiest, Nancy Escoff, the author and a faculty member at the Harvard Medical School, argues that beauty is not a backlash against feminism or a cultural construction or an invention of the fashion industry. It is in our biology. Her book was published in 1999, so 8 years after Naomi Wolf's book. And in the very first chapter of The Survival of the Prettiest, she actually critiques the beauty myth. There is something wrong about the picture Naomi Wolf's book paints. Outside of the realm of ideas, beauty rules. Nobody has stopped looking at it and no one has stopped enjoying the sight. We can say that beauty is dead, but all that does is widen the chasm between the real world and our understanding of it. Suggesting that men have the power to dictate women's behavior and preferences is equivalent to saying women are not only powerless, but mindless. Nancy Escoff's main argument is that government institutions and marketers can exploit universal preferences, but they do not create them. We enjoy certain characteristics the same way little children enjoy the little limbs and big eyes seen in Walt Disney, or the addicting taste that Coca-Cola companies put in their drinks. Her argument is pretty straightforward. We enjoy looking at smooth skin, thick shiny hair, curved waist, and symmetrical bodies because in the course of evolution, the people who held those signals had more reproductive success. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, ideal characteristic and beauty standards might have more to do with sexual selection, fertility, and health than you think. So remember, next time someone compliments you, they're actually paying you homage to your excellent evolutionary biology. Or, in other words, your fertility. This ability to perceive beauty has been long with us before we even existed. Some aspects of beauty might be influenced by cultural upbringing or individual history, but the general idea revolving beauty might just be universal. To further back up her argument, she mentions multiple studies, but I will only dive into one that really caught my attention, which was by Judith Langos. Judith Langos collected 100 slides of people's faces and asked adults to rate their attractiveness. However, when she presented these slides to 3 and 6 month old babies, they stared significantly longer at those they found attractive. And without surprise, those babies turn into adults that are also beauty detectors that prefer symmetrical patterns and soft surfaces. So does this mean we should worry when a baby refuses to stare at us? No, actually, beauty has more to do than just symmetrical pattern or soft surfaces. It also has a lot to do with smell, voice, and obviously personality. Most importantly, this research tells us that our reaction to beauty might be automatic, but our thoughts and behaviors are ultimately under our control. Having both perspectives laid down, I don't believe that it's either one or the other. As Nancy Escoff herself mentioned, universal preferences or beauty standards can be exploited and manipulated. We may enjoy the sight of beautiful, luscious hair, but it doesn't mean that all of us must inherit it. At least not until something makes us feel like we must. These do not exist in isolation, rather they evolve and interact with each other over time. They are heavily influenced by technological advances, social dynamics, and marketing. Nice. Let's talk a bit about marketing. Well, the concept of marketing as we understand it nowadays did not exist back then. We could say that Aphrodite's enduring fame and legacy had a lot to do with the constant exposure people had to her stories and her image. After all, her attributes and stories were crafted in a way to inspire devotion and worship from the Greeks. Similar to how images and stories played a significant role in nurturing Aphrodite's image in ancient times, contemporary marketing strategies continue to shape and reinforce beauty standards in modern society. Through targeted advertisement campaigns, product endorsements by influencers and celebrities, and the portrayal of idealized beauty in various media platforms, marketers perpetuate specific beauty ideals and standards. By associating specific physical attributes or beauty products with success, desirability, and fame, these marketers create this pressure to conform to that very standard. As Deborah L. wrote, puts it in The Beauty Bias, marketing strategies take several forms but often begin by encouraging or exploiting a sense of inadequacy and then identifying a convenient commercial cure. Through science and entrepreneurial efforts, natural characteristics such as wrinkles, hip dips, smile lines, cellulite, crowd feet have become deformities. Essentially, we only ever start questioning or feeling insecure about certain aspects of ourselves when they're being presented as deformities. And that is exactly what marketers tend to do to sell us something. Most of the time, we don't even realize we are being marketed to. Some great examples of this is the way people would promote their music on TikTok, or when they would disguise advertisement for beauty products as an honest review. Constant exposure to tailored content makes it hard for us, the audience, to distinguish when authentic, genuine experiences end and marketing begins. Finally, we can tackle the elephant in the room. Is beauty in the eye of the beholder, or is it culturally influenced? Well, this has been a long debate on whether or not beauty is a subjective perception or an objective experience. And obviously, today we can only scratch the surface. However, I cannot give you the answer, but I hope that by sharing light on different perspectives, you can come to your own conclusion. David Hume, a well-known philosopher, has been famously quoted saying, "Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the minds which contemplates them." I'm sure many of us have experienced disagreeing with other people's personal preferences or having them clash with another's. For example, the debate on whether or not mint ice cream should be a thing, which it shouldn't. I think that's an obvious answer. Some people might think that a certain celebrity has the best looking face, while others would just see them as average. However, is this because our minds perceive different types of beauty, or does it have more to do with our cultural upbringing and our individual history with those things? Others argue beauty is objective. Take, for example, a segment from Beauty Bias. Although conventional wisdom holds that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, in fact, most beholders agree about the appeal of certain characteristics. Facial symmetry, unblemished skin, and an hourglass figure have been widely viewed as evidence of health and fertility. Or in the survival of the prettiest, reverence for beauty is just an escape from morality. It is the perpetual adolescence in us refusing to accept a flawed world. We wave it away with a cliche. Beauty is in the eye of a beholder, meaning that beauty is whatever pleases us. But defined this way, beauty becomes meaningless. Myths are powerful for a lot of reasons. Often they tap into universal themes, feelings that every human can experience or have experienced, such as love, jealousy, betrayal, or heroism. These standards are prevalent due to a combination of cultural, historical, and societal factors. Like I mentioned before, these standards are perpetuated and reinforced through various different of media. Of course, beauty standards aren't just about medical aspects and do have scientific research backing up certain characteristics, but I do feel like the medical aspect comes into play when these standards become deeply ingrained in our consciousness and are perceived as absolute truths rather than interpretations influenced by cultural, societal, and individual experience. I hope that by understanding this and taking bits of what has helped you throughout the video, we can redefine what beauty standards and beauty means for us, starting with how we see ourselves.